because man's task is to make the earth after the model of heaven. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Man's project is to heavenize the earth. Man is made to transform the world from glory to glory, to take hold of it and break it down and remake it after the image of heaven.
Well, welcome back to the Reformed Reset. My name is Grant, and the weaker vessel, my wife Erica, is not joined with me. But today I have a wonderful opportunity to have another guest on the show. And this time we have Dr. George Grant. Dr. Grant, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's my delight. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, you guys probably already can see in the subject line the main point of our conversation. And so I'm really excited too, because honestly, it's a person that I'm intrigued about his life and his work, and I there's some parallels, some contemporary parallels, I think, and I hope we can get into that. But anyway, before we get into all that, guys, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the like button, comment below, tell us how awesome it was to have Dr. Grant on the show. And down below is going to be links to his ministries, to where a lot of his content, his books are at. We'll showcase a few of them just here in a second. So make sure you go down below. And then if you're in podcast world, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and give us a 5-star rating. All those kinds of things, guys, help us to get the podcast, get the show in front of new listeners, and we greatly appreciate it. Dr. Grant, so I want to say I don't remember the first time I encountered your either your works or your sermons or lectures or something. I don't remember now, but one of the first things, I think this is the first book I read of yours, and it's called An Experiment in Liberty. I think I can't find my copy, which makes me think I lent it to somebody. That's what I think happened, because I cannot find it. You were kind enough to grab a copy so we could show the people. There's An Experiment in Liberty, guys. This book is, riveting. If you love America, you love history, Dr. Grant goes through kind of the founding of each state in the colonial period, and then all the different things that led up to America's war for independence. It's fascinating. I couldn't put it down, so I highly recommend you guys go and get An Experiment in Liberty. A link to that will be in the description below too. A couple of popular books Dr. Grant's written. Killer Angel is one, and this is a biography of Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger. I have heard nothing but good things about this book. And then another one about biblical principles for mercy ministry, essentially caring for the poor, called In the Shadow of Plenty. Again, description will be down, a link will be down in the description below, guys. But some of the highlights I just wanted to point out of Dr. Grant's work. So aside from that, would you mind introducing yourself to the listeners if they maybe are not familiar with you and your work?
Sure. I am a pastor in Middle Tennessee, just south of Nashville, in the historic Civil War town of Franklin, Tennessee. And I am involved in a lot of different fun projects. I have podcasts on the Fight Laugh Feast network. I have the Resistance and Reformation podcast. I do a segment for The World and Everything in It, which is World Radio and World Magazine's daily podcast. I am the husband of one, father of three, grandfather of 9, and am exceedingly blessed. I am the trainer for 2 untrainable dogs. And we lived for almost 30 years on a farm just outside of town. We sold it last year.
Oh, wow.
And downsized into this little house in town. where I can practically walk to church, and we're 15 minutes closer to everything, which is delightful. I do miss the deer and the turkeys and all of that. But anyway, so that's a little snapshot. I've written a lot of books on a lot of different subjects, and Lord willing, I still have a few more in me.
That's right. I look forward to that. That'd be great. Thanks for sharing. So my family was able to visit your church. I think this is 2 years ago now. We were visiting with a couple of friends of ours that live on the border of Tennessee, Kentucky, and we their family lives in the Eagleville area. And so we were down with them, and we were like, we got to go to, George Grant's church. We got to be able to go to parish. And what a delightful time. It was great to get to meet you then. And I have a picture. Maybe I'll put the picture up here real quick when I edit this. And our family, we've got both CDs from Clovercroft and listen to them all the time. It's super fun. It's great stuff. These are musicians at their church that it just super talented and really, really good music. So we listen to it all the time. Very wonderful, good stuff. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the life and legacy of Thomas Chalmers. And one thing I learned as I've listened to you is that this was a particular focus of yours. And then I've read again, I must have lent it out, but Thomas Chalmers' famous sermon, The Expulsive Power, and you can find that all over YouTube. It's a very popular sermon of his. And you talk a lot about Thomas Chalmers. You talk about this Keystones thing. So if you could introduce this man, Thomas Chalmers, to us, and what intrigued you to really study him and his work.
Well, in my very first book, Bringing in the Sheaves, I actually made note of Thomas Chalmers. He was famous for his plan to care for the poor. He essentially eliminated the welfare system in the city of Glasgow, which was at the time in the 19th century exploding with industrial growth and crowded with tenements, houses, and exceedingly poor industrial workers. And he eliminated the entire poor law welfare system during Victorian England and Scotland simply by implementing biblical principles of welfare. So I knew about that. I'd heard about the expulsive power of a new affection, the sermon you mentioned, and made note of those. I don't know that I ever ran across him in seminary, but just in my reading, I'd run across him. I just knew that he was some long ago, far away famous preacher. And that I really never thought more about him. He was in a list of great heroes of the faith who cared for the poor in my first book. And then I was out a few years after that speaking at a church in Oregon in an educational conference. And the pastor introduced me as a man who reminded him of Thomas Chalmers. And I thought, oh, well, golly, I don't know if that's a compliment or not. I don't know what that.
That's right.
So during the lunch break, he said, let's go out. We grabbed some lunch, and just a couple of doors down was a little antiquarian bookshop. And he said, let's go see if we can find any treasures. Right. And on the bottom shelf was a volume by Thomas Chalmers. And I snapped it up. I thought, well, if I'm going to be compared to him, I know a little bit about who he was. Well, come to find out, Charles Haddon Spurgeon called him the greatest preacher since the Apostle Paul.
Wow.
He was renowned on both sides of the Atlantic as a master orator, a remarkable reformer, a mentor of men. Ian Murray, the great Reformed historian, said that in 1780, when Thomas Chalmers was born, the Church of Scotland was in the most deplorable state that it had been in since the time of the Reformation.
Mm.
And when he died in 1847, it was at its greatest. And the difference was attributable entirely to him. He was one of the fathers of the modern missions movement. He was one of the fathers of the modern Bible translation and Bible society movement. He was the founder of the Free Church of Scotland when the mainstream church, the Church of Scotland, began to become liberal and was constantly being interfered with by Parliament. He led 400 pastors out of the Church of Scotland. They abandoned their homes, their retirement plan, their churches, and went with him, and they established the Free Church of Scotland. And in the next 5 years, he was able to plant over 500 churches, 500 schools, and in the process, raise the money so that they were all debt-free. Extraordinary, extraordinary. He was a publisher. He wrote about 50 books, and they're extraordinary. And what's so striking is that this man that Spurgeon called the greatest preacher since the Apostle Paul is almost entirely forgotten today.
You're right.
And there are a host of reasons why, but chief among them is that we just don't do our homework and we don't pay attention to the stuff that's important.
Yeah.
So I just became fascinated with Chalmers. I became fascinated by his parish model, which was an approach to pastoring a community rather than merely pastoring a church.
Okay.
The idea is that the pastor really is responsible for every shop holder, every household within a geographical region. And whether a person was a believer or not, attended another church or not, it was his responsibility to pray for them and make himself available to them. It's an incredibly powerful concept. In addition to that, he was a discipler of men. Some of the greatest heroes of the faith in the modern missions movement, in the reforming of society, William Wilberforce, for instance, great preachers like Robert Murray McCheyne or Andrew Bonar or Robert Chalmers Burns, they were all his disciples. We wouldn't have a J. Hudson Taylor, we wouldn't have a David Livingston without Thomas Chalmers. So I just became fascinated by him and have explored his discipleship method, the way that he approached the scriptures, and then taught that to his disciples. I've been fascinated by his approach to ecclesiology, and I've been fascinated by this man who seemed to have a superhuman ability to do anything and everything. So
one of the contemporary-ish, it passed away in 1847. So I guess not contemporary, but a generation prior. But a lot of what he did, aside from becoming an actual politician, reminds me of Abraham Kuyper. So, Kuyper was on the other side of Darwin's Origin of Species, on the other side of America's war between the states and that sort of thing. And, Kuyper loved America. He thought it was, this ideal place, almost like he wished he could be here. But do you see the same thing? It's not very common that you find a pastor theologian who ends up writing about economics. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, first of all, there's a link between Kuyper and Chalmers. That's a really important link. there was it's kind of a long thread, but Robert Haldane, a Scots Presbyterian missionary, went to the city of Geneva and started doing a Bible study at the beginning of the 19th century. And one of the students who was then in the Genevan Academy, which had apostatized since the time of Pierre Viret, the founder of the Genevan Academy, John Calvin, his best friend, and Theodore Beza, Viret's young disciple, who became the successor to Calvin.
Right.
The Genevan Academy had become apostate and no longer even taught the Bible. Well, there was a student named Merle d'Aubigné who went to this Bible study from Haldane. Haldane taught through the book of Romans, and it was life-changing for d'Aubigné. So as a young man, after graduation from the academy, he went to the celebration of the Reformation in Wittenberg in 1817. And there discovered that all of the people celebrating the Reformation didn't know anything about the Reformation. So he decided that he would write the history of the Reformation. He wrote this massive history of the Reformation, still incredibly valuable. It's right on my shelf right over here.
Oh, wow.
Merle d'Aubigné. D'Aubigné went on to become the court preacher for the House of Orange. And there was a very young librarian in the House of Orange, the Dutch royal house, whose name was Groen van Prinsterer. He was converted under d'Aubigné's ministry and then went on to write really important books, founder of the Anti-Revolutionary Party, and eventually came into contact with a young, very liberal, almost unbelieving pastor named Abraham Kuyper.
Yeah.
Merle d'Aubigné, who was the discipler of Groen van Prinsterer, who was the discipler of Abraham Kuyper, was best friends and constant correspondent with Thomas Chalmers. And d'Aubigné, who was won to Christ by Robert Haldane, a Scot, and then discipled by Thomas Chalmers, then became the fountainhead for great Reformation history, and then d'Aubigné's young, line of disciples, leading to Bavinck and Kuyper and a host of others. So it's really interesting to follow the family line. I have a talk that I do where I actually go all the way back to Adam and do a series of begats that lead all the way up to Chalmers and d'Aubigné and Groen van Prinsterer, and then Abraham Kuyper, and then Cornelius van Til and Bavinck and Francis Schaeffer and me.
That's remarkable. I didn't know that. I didn't know those deeper connections with Haldane and d'Aubigné, if I'm saying that correctly, which I want to look up that massive work. That'd be helpful, I'm sure. I
think I've got a copy of it right here, even.
Nice.
Yeah, here it is. This is d'Aubigné's History of the Reformation. This is the small abridged version. There are a host of other volumes. He wrote a wonderful biography of Oliver Cromwell. He wrote. He loved the English and Scottish church, and as a Swiss, French-speaking Swiss, he was fascinated by that. So
I love hearing these stories of men throughout the 1800s, because I don't know, for a long time in my mind, the 1800s was nothing but a bringer of turmoil, a bringer of sorrow, because you have the Second Great Awakening and a lot of the issues that emerged with revivalism, and you kind of lose a strong catechetical aspect to the faith, and then which of course us Presbyterians and stuff cherish. Darwinism, Marxism, war between the states, and then after the war between the states, all the devastating things that happened in politics and to our country. And you're like, oh, the 1800s, like, no one, I don't want to look at that. I don't want to study that. But then you see these bright lights like Kuyper and Bavinck, and then through listening to you, Chalmers, and you hear of the massive work that they did. And I find it encouraging because as dark as times are now, God still has bright lights. So
Amen.
we should never despair. There's always hope, even in the darkest centuries. And then you could flip it on the other side and say, well, the 1800s and late 1800s saw the explosion of missionary work. And so I just like presenting that perspective. And it's funny because, like I said, I never wanted to study the 1800s too much, and then now I'm currently in a class studying Warfield, and so a similar kind of person battling modernism, battling anti-supernaturalism, and really struggling to fight for the faith. And right in the 1800s, early 1900s with him. But anyhow, just want to highlight that, and hopefully it inspires.
The 19th century was a time of great turmoil, but one of the things that Jesus taught his disciples is that history often looks like that, where the wheat and the tares grow up together. So in times where you have wheat maturation, you're also going to have tares maturation.
Yeah.
So at the very moment that we have, the rise of Marxism, the revolutions of 1848, which brought tumult to all of the European and South American nations, we have the beginnings of civil wars. We think of the American Civil War as unique, but there were civil wars in Russia, in Germany, in Austria, in Italy. You think about Garibaldi and all of the revolutions that he brought there, Bolivar in South America. So the American Revolution, the Civil War, was a revolutionary thing in our context,
Sure.
But it wasn't revolutionary in the context of the 19th century. It was actually common. And going all the way into the 20th century with the Bolshevik revolutions and the overthrow of the Habsburgs and the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, all of it is so incredibly disruptive. Yeah. And yet, during all of that tare maturation, we have the launching of the missions movement that spreads all over the world, the beginning of Bible societies, and the rise of great preachers like Chalmers and Daubigny's work in the House of Orange, leading to Kuyper and Bavinck. It's really quite remarkable. And then all of that spills back over across the Atlantic as we get people like Cornelius Van Til and Machen, and Warfield is deeply influenced by that whole movement. John Murray, Francis Schaeffer, right on down to our day.
Right. Yeah, that's fantastic. So for today, what benefit or what relevance does Chalmers have today? You have worked hard to promulgate his work. What benefit is it to today? And maybe this would be a good opportunity to talk about the keystones.
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that is remarkable about Chalmers is he was ordained when he was 19 in the Church of Scotland. But the thing is that the Church of Scotland had a rule that you could not be ordained until you were 21.
Mhm.
So he was precocious. He went to the University of St. Andrews when he was 11. So this is an incredibly precocious, gifted mind.
Mhm.
He eventually became the pastor of a little church not far from St. Andrews called Kilmeny. And he pastored there for about 5 years before he was converted. So all that time that he was, this masterful orator and this wonder kid in the Church of Scotland, he didn't understand the gospel yet.
Wow.
So when he came to Christ as a pastor, he suddenly threw himself into the scriptures with an unprecedented abandon. And he began to study the scriptures like never before. And the thing that he kept that was a compulsion for him was he felt like he was making up for lost time, that he had squandered all those early years and those early opportunities and his early gifts. So he wanted to come up with a way to really absorb the scriptures and go deep in them. And so in the first year of his conversion, he decided that he would read through the entire New Testament carefully, using the old medieval Lectio Divina method of read, think, pray, live, a deep meditation in the scriptures. But he would add a kind of reformational twist to it, where he would attempt to identify elements of the gospel in every single chapter, and then attempt to identify a single verse in every chapter of the New Testament that would sort of either summarize or be the pivot point of the argument in that chapter. So his idea was, if I can memorize 6 verses from the book of Ephesians, I will have the entire arc of Paul's argument in Ephesians. I'll grasp that book. If I memorize 16 verses in the book of Romans, just 16 verses, I'll have the whole argument of the book of Romans and see the whole outline and the flow. Well, he did that the first year after his conversion, and it was so powerful, transformed his preaching, transformed the way he read and studied the Bible, transformed his prayer life, that he began to disciple his young men in the church using that same method. And it became this explosive movement of discipleship. There are several books that are written just about the lives of farmers and laborers in his church who came to be known as missionaries of Fife or missionaries of Kilmeny. It was extraordinary. He never actually systemized it, and he never wrote it down anywhere. So I decided I was going to try and track it down and find as many of the pieces as I could from letters, from his students, from years later. And what I was able to do is piece together his plan. And so we've published it, and it's a way to study the Bible. It can be used in groups. It can be used in home schools. We use it in our classical school here in Franklin. And so we're in the process of creating a version for kids. We've already done the prototype for kids. Anyway, it's been transformative for me. It was transformative in the early 19th century for the Free Church of Scotland. And anyway, I love the method. It's just simply called Keystones, Making Disciples.
That's awesome. I have the first volume. I think it's the Gospels.
The Gospels, the 4 Gospels, yeah.
I have that one, and it's sort of you got to adjust to the process and learn it a little bit.
Yeah, it's a bit of a deep dive.
Yeah, and it's helpful. The first chunk of it is you explaining it, And so that's incredibly helpful for reference and for understanding how to get the most out of the process. And it's very similar to, but it's better, it's deeper than a simple inductive Bible study kind of
Right,
process.
right.
But the memorization, the keystone verse, the memorization, and also the gospel, seeing the gospel in all of Scripture, I think that's awesome. That's so helpful and really good. So cool. I really wanted to talk about that because it's really awesome. And another question, and this is kind of on the education thing that you referenced a little bit. One of the things it seems you have invested a lot of time in your own life's ministry is in classical education or just education in general, writing curriculums. Um, is that directly tied to your study of Chalmers and what he did, or even if it's not, what have you applied from what you've learned of Chalmers, and why is this education piece so important?
Well, the responsibility of every pastor is to work himself out of a job.
Great, yeah.
That's my job, to work myself out of a job. The way I do that is I raise up the next generation of leaders. I raise up the next generation of disciplers, pastors, missionaries, businessmen, lawyers, politicians. And so what that means is we've got to be really intentional because we live in a corrosive culture.
Mm.
And if we're going to resist the lure of the world and reform it simultaneously, which is oftentimes the error that as Christians we make. We either throw ourselves into reformation or we throw ourselves into resistance.
Mm.
But the call of the gospel is both
Mm.
resistance and reformation. So we have to be really intentional about that. So many years ago, when my children were young, I had the conviction that they needed to be homeschooled. And so I foisted that responsibility off of my wife. And so she had the responsibility to carry out my conviction.
Mhm.
And I realized as my children started to get a little older and not surprisingly had strong wills and were resistant to the instruction of their mother, as boys oftentimes can be as they approach teen years. I realized I needed to engage more.
Mm.
And so we started first a classical schooling co-op, classical meaning going back, ad fontes, going back to the sources, reading the great books, listening to the great music, learning about the great art and architecture, etc. And eventually it became a classical school with co-op elements. It's kind of a hybrid school, 3 day a week kind of thing initially. Then we added a 2 day a week component, so you can go a Tuesday, Thursday, or a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule, or both. And that was more than 30 years ago that we did that. I didn't really know a whole lot about Chalmers then,
Okay.
but I found that Chalmers was doing the very same kind of thing, beginning with his time in Glasgow after he left Kilmeny. And so there was a lot of overlap. And the Free Church of Scotland established schools in every church that they planted. So
Okay.
every church had a school, even if the school only had 9 or 10 kids in it. Every church plant had a school. And that's a part of the vision. It's covenantal succession. It's recognizing that we've got to, in a corrosive culture, you've got to be very, very purposeful and intentional and, quite frankly, sacrificial.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Very good. We homeschool. I was homeschooled my whole life, and just kind of grew up with that same the same idea. It has to be a purposeful vigilance, right, against
Amen.
that
Yes.
corrosion. Yeah, and that's um,
Because the tug of the world is incredibly strong and it is everywhere.
yeah.
You know, we live at a time where digital media
Mhm.
and all of that can be a blessing, but it can really be a curse. And so we have to just be constantly on guard.
Yeah, amen. And with social media today, I feel like that's the new frontier of the black hole that can be created um by the very thing you're talking about.
No
Um,
doubt.
okay, so a couple of more questions that I thought would be kind of fun, interesting. Are there any lesser known aspects of Chalmers' life or work you find particularly interesting or noteworthy?
Well, he was a partner with William Wilberforce in the work of the abolition of the slave trade,
Nice.
which was incredibly courageous.
Yeah.
Uh, he was also, and this is really interesting, he was an advocate for the not just the emancipation of slaves, but he was an advocate for full citizenship rights
Mm,
for unbelievers and Roman Catholics, which was incredibly unpopular in
mm,
Scotland. Uh, but one of the things that Chalmers believed was he believed in the power of genuine freedom.
mm,
And he believed that if the church does its job with the ordinary means of grace, there is greater power in that than in the suppression of various things that we might disagree with.
mhm.
That doesn't mean that he was permissive of true wickedness.
Right.
It's just that, so for instance, he wouldn't be in favor of banning books, but he also wouldn't be in favor of pornography being in our school libraries.
Right.
Uh, Progressives want to say that it's the same thing. It's not the same thing.
Mm,
Uh, so, the fact that he was so ecumenical in his
mhm,
approach, he had dear, dear friends who were Baptists and one of his disciples and a former assistant pastor was one of the fathers of the Pentecostal movement.
mm,
Uh, he didn't agree with the principles that
mhm,
either the Baptists, because he was a Presbyterian, or the Pentecostals, because he was a cessationist,
mhm.
or those who had really ardent views uh, about the rehabilitation of the Jews to a homeland in Palestine, all of those kinds of things. That was all swirling in the early 19th century. And he was able to be close friends and come side by side with co-belligerents in the day.
Yeah.
He had this remarkable ability to be a friendly part of all of the good things that were going on in all of these different circles. And
Yeah.
that was rare, really rare in that day. It's rare in our day.
Yeah, that's very difficult. Polarization seems to be the idea of the day is, you have this identity and you just polarize from anything different than you. And it's really, yeah, very difficult.
He had a once a month standing appointment once a month to go have coffee with a Roman Catholic priest.
Hmm.
Uh, and people would say to him, "How can you be friends with a priest?" And he would say, "Well, he's delightful and he's well read, and I share the gospel with him every single time we meet."
There
I
you
mean,
go.
how do you argue against that?
Yeah, exactly. How could you fight? How could you fight against that? Um, uh, works of Chalmers that you would encourage people to go to first. What would be the introduction to Chalmers that you would recommend to people?
Well, there's a little book. It's not a book by Chalmers, and it's really not even a book about Chalmers. except in a tangential way.
Mm.
It's published by Banner of Truth, and it's called the St. Andrews Seven. And
Okay.
it tells the story of when Chalmers went as a professor back to his alma mater, St. Andrews University,
Right.
and he became a professor there, and he gathered around himself a circle of disciples, 6 of whom were extraordinarily noteworthy.
Mm.
And it tells the story of those 6 disciples and their relationship with Chalmers. So I always tell people to go there first.
Okay.
That's my go-to.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned at the start of this podcast the great sermon that Chalmers preached and has been reprinted. It's never been out of print since he preached it. The Expulsive Power of a New Affection.
Yeah.
It's a great sermon. I've had 3 different times. I have had students of mine who have resisted the gospel, though they were raised in Christian homes and were sent to a Christian school. They resisted the gospel, had all kinds of questions. When they finally sat down and read that, they were converted.
Wow, that's powerful.
So it's a powerful little thing.
Yeah.
I have a reprint version of it that's on my website, georgegrant.net, and there's a wonderful, and I've got a little introduction that sets it in its historical context.
Yeah.
Crossway's got a printed version with a little intro by John Piper.
Okay.
And it's everywhere on the internet, as you mentioned.
Yeah. I looked it up on YouTube. I wonder if people have. Yeah, so there's many people that have read it and done an audio.
Oh yeah. Sermon Audio's got several versions.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, and I remember having to double check because I thought it was the explosive power of a new affection, but it's expulsive. It kicks it out, kicks out your old one, and the grace of God.
The idea he starts with, it's just a brilliant notion, and that is that when a man falls in love with a woman, he doesn't have to remind himself to think of her. It's like all of the other cares, all of the other things that had crowded his life and his mind before, they're just expelled.
Yeah.
So when we fall in love with Jesus through the power of the gospel and the application of the work of the Holy Spirit, there is this expulsive power that this new affection crowds out. So his argument is, you can't manage your pet sins. You are probably not going to be successful in fighting against your pet sins. What happens when we have real sanctification in our lives is that we've so fallen in love with Christ that there's just not room anymore for those old affections.
Beautiful. Go read it, guys. It's a great sermon, and it's a huge benefit. Any last words on Chalmers, Pastor Grant, that you'd like to share?
Well, Karen and I, my wife and I, are going to head off to Scotland at the end of September, Lord willing, and we're going to spend a month there, including 2 weeks in Chalmers' hometown, Anstruther. And I'm hoping and praying, one of my lifetime goals at this point now, I guess you'd call it a bucket list goal, is to write the big biography of Chalmers.
Oh, that'd be great.
And so that's one of the things that I hope the Lord allows me to do before he brings me home.
That would be fantastic.
So we're going to head off, and we'll as I always do when I'm over there, take lots of pictures and write lots of notes. And I bought access with a membership to New College Edinburgh's library so that I can actually go and work with the archives themselves. I have virtually everything that Chalmers published, which has been, it's been a huge undertaking to collect the books. But I've got them all. But there are enormous numbers of letters and other things. So I'm looking forward to digging into all of that.
Yeah, I bet. Maybe even church records or like
Right.
things like that
And
too.
I've got a lot of those. I've been able to
Okay.
accumulate a lot of those in my
Yeah.
archives. And Banner of Truth actually published a few years ago a collection of his letters.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And it's great, but it's less than half
Oh my
of the
goodness.
extant letters that he actually wrote. So while Banner of Truth did a great job of kind of going through and finding the really good stuff,
Yeah.
this is by no means everything. So
Wow.
yeah.
Great. That's great. All right, guys. Well, I hope you're inspired to go check out Thomas Chalmers and his work and all the things that we've been talking about. I hope to continue to read more and more of him as well. And I found, and I sent you a picture of this because you were the first person to come to mind, because I actually don't know anyone else who is promoting Thomas Chalmers like you do. But here in our little town in Middle Maine, there's a big antique shop in the middle of the town, and my wife and I love just thrift stores. You know, I always go to the books, and she walks up with this and says, is this anything? And I just see sermons and Chalmers, and I thought it might be something. And I open up and look, and it looks really old. And I think it is mid 1800s. It was when it was printed, and it's a collection. I think it's 10 sermons from a church he pastored. The name escapes me, the name of the church. And it was kind of
probably either Tron Church or St.
yes,
John's.
Tron Church. Tron Church. And it was like in gratitude because he had moved on or something. So it was like kind of their favorite sermons. And I just thought, how in the world did I find this here in the middle of Maine? But it was such a cool find. And so I'm excited to continue to learn about Chalmers. Pastor Grant, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing with us about Chalmers and a little bit about his life and legacy. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's been a joy. As you can probably tell, I love talking about it. So it's a lot of fun.
All right, guys. Don't forget, again, go down, check out the links in the description and subscribe and do all that stuff to help out the show. And until next time, take hold and reorder creation by first reforming your home. This has been the Reformed Reset.
But on the basis of grace and on the finished work of Jesus Christ, the project is back and forth, and the destiny of a new transformed world is assured.
I just put the sourdough in the oven too, so I've got like 40 minutes.